we start, do you think? Fascism, as I'm sure you know, emerged in Italy after the First World War. The fascist movement was founded by Mussolini in March 1919 in Milan.
Mussolini's image, as you know, was massively present in Italian life during the fascist years, not just in terms of visual arts, paintings, sculptures, but also, as you know, photographs, photomontages. It was very, very, very used, and it was central to the propaganda machine of the regime.
It's always important to bear in mind with Mussolini that communication was something that he was extremely sensitive to. This is something that was also true of a number of other European dictators of the 20th century, but let's not forget that Mussolini was the prototype in many respects for the others, and his particular sensibilities, his particular type of relationship with the mass media, with the masses, with the crowds, was something that others copied.
And after fascism becomes a dictatorship in 1925, the cult of Mussolini as this providential figure, this embodiment of all that's quintessentially Italian, becomes central to the regime as a point of cohesion. And really that's the sort of lowest common denominator of support for fascism. You believed in the Duce. And that cult of the Duce was very strongly encouraged by the regime through a variety of channels. And this idea developed: the Duce was an all-knowing, all-powerful person.
The regime tried very hard to create a series of iconographies of its leader, and I talk about iconographies rather than a single iconography because Mussolini seems right from the beginning of the dictatorship to have taken up different public personas.
Here we have a selection of postcards which display various aspects of the personality cult. We see Mussolini surrounded by crowds, a particular depiction which indicates, of course, his popularity. We also see Mussolini the sportsman, the skier. We see Mussolini the historical figure in the guise of Napoleon, but also standing in full uniform in front of the Colosseum. Postcards were a very important factor in the cult of Mussolini for a number of reasons. First, because they were produced not only by the state and fascist party organizations, but by commercial companies. Secondly, they were important because people didn't just send them as they might any postcard, but they actually collected them.
I have identified four main types of portraits of Mussolini that were prominent during the regime. The first type was the realistic portrait, what you will see here, for instance, and it served mainly official purposes and purposes of recognizability. And then there was the symbolic portrait, like this, for instance, where he's portrayed as a builder, were still realistic in style, but they had a more symbolic content. And so Mussolini was portrayed as a builder, the builder of the nation, or a blacksmith, like here, like the great forger of the nation.
Liberalism was really dead. The liberalism had betrayed the ideals of Risorgimento. The liberalism had not given the great Italy that the Risorgimento in the 19th century had longed for. So fascism placed itself very much in the ideology that was going to recover the true identity of the Italian nation as an heir of medieval republics, or ultimately the Roman Empire.
Many commentators have talked about the importance, for instance, of the classical iconography of Caesar, the kind of imperial Mussolini as the empire, the actual sort of empire, becomes stronger.
You can see here Mussolini is sculpted in the style of Roman statuary, and he's wearing, and I don't know if you can see it, but he's wearing an infula, which was a headband that was worn and in classical statuary and symbolized being consecrated by the gods. Clearly, this type of portraits, this type of sculptures associated Mussolini with Romanness. The myth of Rome was key and was fundamental to the construction of fascist ideology. So basically, the image of Mussolini was appropriated in that sense and manipulated in that sense. So portraying Mussolini according to sort of the Roman canon associated him with the great Roman emperors.
Mussolini was turned very early on into an art object. A very considerable period of time each day was devoted in the 1920s to him sitting or standing, posing anyway, for artists and sculptors. And I think that was a very useful investment of time in some respects, because it helped create two ideas. First of all, that Mussolini was a man worthy of being represented, and secondly, that he was a man who was living history, because of course busts and statues were typically created of people who had already achieved a lot or who were dead. And Mussolini was the man who was the living embodiment of history, and that was something that was deeply at the core of fascism itself, that it was a movement that was making the past in the present, that it was forging the present and forging a historical existence even as it was going about its particular daily activities.
But what happened with fascism was really it exploded into life, if that's the appropriate phrase, in the latter part of 1920, primarily as a reaction against the spread of socialism in northern and central Italy. There was a fairly strong socialist movement based in the Po Valley, spreading down into Tuscany and Umbria. And the government of Italy, for various reasons, felt rather powerless to do much about this. So what happened was that you got squads, and these illustrations at the back here, which are actually from the Second World War, but they pick up on early, what's called squadrismo, going back to 1920-21. And these various squads developed very, very fast in northern and central Italy. The movement took off, much to Mussolini's surprise, and became increasingly right-wing. It became sponsored by landowners, by businessmen who were fed up with the socialists and fed up with the strikes, and it became a sort of mass movement in northern and central Italy. And on the back of this movement, Mussolini was able to come to power in October 1922, following the so-called March on Rome. But it was a movement born very much of violence. And I think these pictures here, from the end of fascism, in a way a reflection on the part of an artist who himself had been a supporter of the regime on, the fruits of fascism. This is how it started.